Hi there, BookTube. Now, you know when people do those Q&A things, for a certain, they've reached a certain number of subscribers or something like that. One of the questions that often comes up is, how has BookTube changed your reading or affected your reading habits, or, that sort of thing? And one thing that I know is that since I've been watching and then making videos in the BookTube community, as it were, is certain months of the year are inextricably associated in my mind now with certain types of reading, types of book. So we're just coming to the end of October as I record this, and I'm still enjoying my last Victober choice, Victorian novel, and November is nearly here, and November, in my mind, is always tied up now with nonfiction and reading indigenous authors, because of Nonfiction November and Indigeathon. Now, so here's my sort of TBR plans for November, linked a lot to those two events. Indigeathon is not happening in its previous form this year, but the lovely and wonderful Kim from Native Lady Book Warrior is doing a sort of a new version of the same essential idea, and she's calling it the Snowdon Readathon, and she's done lovely sort of prompts and bingo cards and all that stuff. But the essential of it is to try and read something, and maybe more than one thing, by an Indigenous writer. And I've got three lined up. Two of them are sort of like modern classics, I guess, by Indigenous authors. First of those is Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, which was published in 1977. And it's one of those books that I can't quite believe I haven't read yet, if you know what I mean. It's about a young man who has been a prisoner of war in World War II, a Japanese prisoner of war, and he comes back to the Laguna Pueblo reservation, and as I understand it, kind of turns to Laguna Pueblo sort of stories and culture and traditions and ceremonies as part of his sort of road perhaps to restoring himself. We'll see. Second Snowdon choice for me is by a Maori writer, Patricia Grace. It's called Potiki. It was published in 1986. And my sort of understanding of what it's about is that it's a Maori coastal community that is threatened in effect by a developer that wants to build certain things on their land and in the sea by their bit of coast. And it's in multiple voices, which is something I always enjoy if it's done well, and I'm really excited to read this book because I know that it was one of Sean the Book Maniac's top books of the year last year, so that's a great recommendation for me. My third Snowdon choice is by an author who's kind of growing into being one of my new favourite authors, and that's Louise Erdrich. And I very much mean to read more and more by her. And so I'm going to read The Night Watchman, which was her 2020 book, which I've had for about a year now and just not quite got around to yet. So thank you, Kim, and the Snowdon Readathon, for giving me that extra shove that I sometimes need to get something to the top of the pile, as it were. Now, that's my three Indigenous author books. But thinking about authors that you talk about perhaps as a favourite, but you've only actually read a couple of their books and just mean to read more. Well, another of those for me, like Erdrich, is WG Sebald, the German writer. And I've only actually read two of his books. One was Austerlitz and the other was The Rings of Saturn. But they were both absolute stunners for me, the kind of book that I really love. He has this extraordinary kind of digressive, discursive way of writing, fiction that feels almost like non-fiction. I don't know. It's great stuff. And so I'm finally going to read a third, and I'm going to read The Immigrants, his 1992 book. And thank you, Sina, from Beating Around the Books, for sort of getting that one off the starting line for me. And she's going to read it in the original German, and I will read it in Anthea Bale's translation, and we'll see how we get on. Now, the next author I'm going to talk about, I've only read one book by, but when I read that book, the years for Nonfiction November last year, I immediately thought this writer has absolutely has the potential to become a beloved and admired writer of mine, and that's Annie Ernaux. And so when she then because it was one of my books of the year last year. So when she just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I was sort of thrilled and delighted. But I also thought I really do need to get back and read a second or a third of hers. Now, as it happens, Bob the Bookerer can't resist a good pun. So he suggested that we should make it November and read some Ernaux this November. And so I'm game for that. And the first of the four that he's suggesting is happening. So that's the one that I'm going to pick and read. Came out in 2000. It's a short memoir about her experience of facing an unwanted pregnancy in France in the 1960s as a very young woman, and how she dealt with that. It's the first, I guess, it is definitely the first of my non-fiction November choices as well. And as a memoir, Non-Fiction November is a venerable booktube institution, and you probably know that it's Oliver for Book Olive that kind of hosts it. And each year she picks 4 individual words as the prompt. So not you can kind of make associations in your mind between non-fiction books and those 4 words, and use that to sort of make your choices. So it's do-it-yourself prompts, I guess. And of course, Happening fits really well with one of those prompts, because one of them is secrets, and you can see how that links. My second non-fiction November choice is this one. Uncomfortable Labels, My Life as a Gay Autistic Trans Woman. Now, I've been meaning to read this, by Laura Kate Dale, for a few months. I found it when I was looking for books to talk about in the Stand With Trans Kids tag, which if you haven't done, you should. I'll link below to the original and so on. But it seemed to fit really well for Non-Fiction November, for the prompt elements, because I think almost one of the themes of the book is how Dale brings together the different elements of her identity and how that shaped her and how they kind of interact and intersect. I'm very much looking forward to this one. I'm also looking forward to finally reading a non-fiction book that I think I got for my birthday in January, probably from Tilly, and it's a shoe-in for the third single word prompt, which is record, because it's called Footnotes, and it's a record of Peter Fiennes' journey around Britain, kind of in the footsteps of various writers, people from Enid Blyton to Charles Dickens, and recording their links with the landscape. It's got maps in it. I do love a book with a map. And books about it's about 2 of my favourite topics, landscape and literature. So what's not to love? I hope it lives up to expectations. Now the fourth word prompt is border, and the book that I've picked for border is a slightly perhaps more tangential link, but it makes sense to me. I'll explain. So the book is Ghost in the Throat by Doireen Griofa. I hope I pronounced that right. Irish author, and I think that I can link that to border because it's a book that crosses borders of genre. You know, it's somewhere between, or moves back and forward between the boundaries of memoir and fiction and poetry and kind of literary studies and literary history. I'm quite excited about it because my very erudite and interesting sister-in-law recommended. She's just finished reading it and was really sort of said, this is a book you're going to love, Roz. So that's my fourth one. Having said that, I've got another book that fits even better with the border prompt, which I hope to get to as well, and that, because that's called Borderland, and it's by Anna Reid, and it's a journey through the history of the Ukraine. And if you follow my daughter's channel, Tilly Shelfertall, you'll know that she's been on a bit of a slow but persistent mission this year to read things by Ukrainian authors or about Ukraine, and she's kind of sucked me into that a bit, I guess. And one of the things that we did was we read 2 modern Ukrainian plays earlier in the year, and our play for November is going to be a classic play by a Ukrainian author, and that's The Government Inspector by Nikolai Gogol, which he wrote in 1836, and then I think he did a revised version a few years later, and I'm not sure which version we'll read actually. Now, Gogol wrote in Russian, but he was born in the Ukraine. He came from sort of Ukrainian family. He grew up speaking both Russian and Ukrainian, you know, so I think like now perhaps, well, both Russia and Ukraine might like to claim him, but you know, he is, yeah, although he wrote in Russian, I think he should really be seen perhaps as a Ukrainian author. Anyway, that's going to be our discussing drama choice for November. That's the last of my definites for November. That I think is 10 books. I also need to read my next chunk of Canterbury Tales and The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. So that could be sufficient really. But then guess what happened? I got tempted into something else. So Mark of Bookdown with Elvis has this fun thing that he does whenever there's a major football tournament of doing a kind of a reading challenge to go with the football tournament, and I couldn't resist it. It's the World Cup that starts in the middle of November, and I'll link to his announcement video so you can understand this better than I will explain it. But essentially what he does is he does a draw, and everyone taking part is allocated a country, a team that's taking part in the World Cup this time, and you have to read something that's by a writer from your country that you've got. But then as the tournament proceeds, the other things that you read depend on whether your team wins or loses, and you know how they proceed through the tournament. He explains it. Anyway, fortunately, it is allowed to read a short story or a poem or an essay or something by a writer from your country, each country, rather than a whole book, because otherwise I'd definitely be defeated, wouldn't I? So that's my, as ever, slightly ambitious plans, but I think doable. I hope you've also got some brilliant November plans, and maybe you're doing nonfiction November or the Skoden version of Indigathon, or are you going to do Mark's World Cup Challenge? There's still just time to sign up for that if you act quickly after I upload this. I think he does the draw on the 4th of November. So there we go. Have a great November planning, everybody.